The dim, flickering lights above cast shadows across the cold, metallic walls of the chamber. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each one a painful reminder of the bruises on her ribs. She could feel the chains biting into her wrists, cold and unforgiving. She had lost track of how many days, or was it weeks, she had been here. Time was meaningless in this hellish place, where every day blended into the next in a blur of pain and despair. Her name, once something that had held meaning, was now lost to the emptiness around her. All she could remember was the feeling of being dragged away from everything she had ever known, stripped of her humanity, and tossed into a cage like an animal. And for what? To serve the whims of alien creatures who treated her as little more than a possession. A thing to be owned, used, and discarded. She had been brought to this alien world, her body broken and bruised by the time she had arrived. They called themselves the Zarnath, a race of beings far superior to humanity in their eyes. Their cold, emotionless faces, with their pale blue skin and elongated limbs, were a reminder of how insignificant she was in their universe. And yet, as she lay on the cold floor, shivering from both the dampness and the fear that gripped her heart, something inside her refused to give up. A flicker of hope remained, buried beneath the overwhelming weight of despair. She had heard rumors, whispers in the dark corners of the slave quarters, that one day, someone might come. Someone who could change everything. She had dismissed those rumors at first, assuming they were just another cruel joke. But now, in the silence of her prison, she clung to that hope with the last vestiges of her strength. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor. Heavy. Measured. The sound of someone, or something, approaching. She tensed, every muscle in her body aching, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Who was it? Another alien? Would they come to drag her out for another round of punishment, or worse? The footsteps grew louder. Then, a shadow appeared at the doorway. Her heart raced, but her body refused to obey her commands. She was too weak to stand, too broken to run. The figure that stepped into the room was not what she expected. A human. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about him that made her feel, almost, safe. Almost. He paused for a moment, taking in the sight of her. His gaze flicked to the chains around her wrists, the bruises on her skin, the hollow emptiness in her eyes. Without a word, he moved toward her, each step purposeful, deliberate. She flinched instinctively, but he didn't react. He didn't lash out. He simply reached for the chains. For a moment, all she could do was stare at him, as if she had imagined him. Maybe he wasn't real. Maybe he was just another cruel fantasy her mind had created to distract her from the unbearable reality. But then she saw the small device in his hand, a strange tool that hummed with a soft, low frequency. It buzzed as it came into contact with the chains, and with a loud snap, they fell away from her wrists. She gasped, her sore limbs trembling from the sudden freedom. She was free. But for how long? The thought crossed her mind like a fleeting whisper, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't afford to think like that now. Not when there was a chance, just a sliver of a chance, that she could escape this nightmare. The man stepped back, watching her carefully. He didn't speak, but his gaze was unwavering. She could feel the weight of it, the silent scrutiny. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? What was there left to say? "You're safe now," his voice was low, calm, almost soothing. It was the first kind thing she had heard in what felt like forever. Safe? The word seemed almost alien to her now, like something out of reach. But she couldn't ignore the faint glimmer of something inside her. Hope, maybe? She had to believe it. She had to. Her voice cracked as she tried to speak, the dryness of her throat making it difficult to form coherent words. "Who are you?" she managed. He took a step closer, his expression softening ever so slightly. "I'm someone who's been waiting for you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight, an unspoken truth. He wasn't here by accident. He had come for her. But why? What did he want from her? "I don't understand," she whispered, her eyes darting between him and the door, her mind racing with possibilities. Could he be here to help her? Or was this another trick? A new form of torment? He seemed to sense her hesitation, and his lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "It's okay. You don't have to trust me yet. But we need to get out of here. Now." His words were clear, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to run, to escape, but her body wouldn't obey. She was too tired, too broken. Before she could respond, the ground beneath them shook, a deep rumble reverberating through the walls. The lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't come back on. Darkness swallowed the room, and she heard the distant sound of something huge, moving. "What is that?" she gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. The fear that had been buried beneath the numbness surged back to the surface. The man's eyes flashed with urgency. "They've found us. We need to move, now." She didn't have time to think. She didn't have time to question anything. She had to follow him, had to trust him. It was the only chance she had. But as she struggled to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her, the door to the chamber exploded open. Figures, dark, hulking, and unmistakably alien, poured into the room. They were here. They had found her. And they weren't about to let her go without a fight. The human grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. "Come on. Move." And just like that, she was running. Running for her life. But there was no guarantee of escape. No promise of safety. Only the uncertain unknown of what lay ahead. The cold wind bit at her skin as she ran. Her legs, stiff and weak from days of captivity, protested with each step, but she pushed forward, following the human who had just freed her. The alien creatures chasing them made guttural, terrifying noises behind them, their heavy footsteps thundering across the metal floors. But the man was faster, stronger, he knew where to go. He led her through narrow corridors, sharp turns, and hidden passageways, always a step ahead of the pursuing aliens. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't know if they would make it. But she couldn't stop running. Not now. The human's grip on her arm was firm, yet not painful. There was something calming in his touch, something that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she had a chance. He didn't speak as they ran, but she could sense the urgency in his movements. He knew what was at stake, and she could feel it too. The air was thick with tension, each breath heavier than the last. They rounded a corner, and for a brief moment, the sounds of their pursuers grew faint. The human pulled her into a small, dimly lit alcove, just off the main passageway. He pressed her against the wall, his hand over her mouth to keep her quiet. She could feel his heart pounding in his chest, just as hers was. They both stood there, motionless, waiting for the alien footsteps to fade. The silence stretched on, deafening in its intensity. She wanted to speak, to ask him who he was, what he wanted from her, but she knew that now wasn't the time. Their lives hung in the balance. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of the alien's pursuit grew distant. The human slowly lowered his hand from her mouth, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, something that made her question the decisions she had made in the last few minutes. Was he really here to help her? Or was this just another trick? The questions swirled in her mind, but before she could voice them, he spoke. "Stay quiet," he said in a low, steady voice. "They'll be back. We need to keep moving, but we have to be smart." Her mind raced, but her body was too exhausted to argue. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her shoulders. And for a moment, she just stood there, trying to catch her breath. I don't understand, she whispered. Why are you helping me? Who are you? He didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the hallway outside, scanning for any signs of danger, before he turned back to her. I'm someone who's trying to end this nightmare. And you're part of that. She frowned, confusion still clouding her thoughts. Part of what? What is this place? Why did they keep me here? And why did you buy me? His expression softened, but there was something almost resigned in the way he looked at her. There's no time for answers right now. But you need to understand something, he said, his voice lower now, almost as if he were sharing a secret. You're not just some random human they caught. They've been keeping you for a reason. You're important. More than you realize. She stared at him, the words sinking into her like stones in water. What did he mean by that? What made her so special? She opened her mouth to ask, but he cut her off. Later, he said quickly. We don't have time. He motioned for her to follow him, and she did, albeit reluctantly. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story than he was letting on. But she had no choice. She had to trust him. For now. They moved silently through the twisting corridors, each step more calculated than the last. Every corner they turned, every shadow they passed, could hide danger. She could feel the weight of it, the pressure building as the seconds ticked by. The aliens could be anywhere. She had no idea how they were navigating this strange place, but the human seemed to know it like the back of his hand. Eventually, they reached a large, circular chamber. The walls were made of a strange, dark metal, and the air was thick with the smell of something alien. The human signaled for her to stay close, then motioned to a door on the far side of the room. Without hesitation, he approached it and placed his hand on a small, recessed panel. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a small room beyond. The human stepped inside, and she followed, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Once inside, he quickly sealed the door behind them. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of machinery somewhere deep within the walls. The human turned to face her, his expression more serious now. We have a moment, he said, his voice low. We can talk. She didn't know what to say. The silence stretched on, but eventually, she found the courage to speak. Why did you buy me? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. What do you want from me? He paused, his eyes flicking to the floor before meeting her gaze again. I didn't buy you for the reasons you think. I wasn't looking for a slave. I was looking for a way to stop them. The Zarnath, the aliens who captured you, they've been doing this for years. Taking humans. Experimenting on them. Using them like tools. She shook her head, still trying to process what he was saying. But why me? I'm just a person. What makes me special? He stepped closer, his expression softening. You're not just anyone. There's something in your blood, something that they need. And I'm here to make sure you don't end up like the others. Her breath caught in her throat. The idea that she might be different, that her blood held something the aliens wanted, was both terrifying and thrilling. She had never felt special, never thought there was anything extraordinary about her. But now, standing in this strange room, with this stranger who seemed to know far more than she did, everything felt different. What do you mean by that? She asked. What do they want with me? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. They've been studying humans for centuries. They've figured out how to manipulate our biology, our DNA, and they're using it to create something dangerous. They want to create hybrids, beings that are part human, part Zarnath. They believe these hybrids will be the perfect soldiers, capable of surviving their hostile environments and fighting their wars. And you, He paused, looking at her with a mixture of sympathy and urgency. "You're the key to stopping them." She stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "How can I be the key?" His gaze softened, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw a flicker of something like hope in his eyes. "You have the ability to stop them. But first, we need to get you to a place where we can help you understand how." The room felt smaller now, the air thicker with the tension between them. She didn't know whether to believe him or not. The idea that she was somehow connected to this larger battle, that her blood held the answer to stopping the aliens, was almost too much to comprehend. But what choice did she have? She had to trust him. She had to trust that he wasn't lying. Before she could respond, a loud banging on the door interrupted the moment. The sound of alien voices filled the room, their guttural language vibrating through the walls. "We don't have much time," the man said urgently, his hand reaching for the control panel on the wall. "We need to move, now." The door rattled again, louder this time, as if the aliens were trying to force their way in. He turned to her, eyes intense. "Are you ready?" She didn't have a choice. "Yes." The human hit a button, and the room shifted. Another passageway opened up in front of them. She had no idea where it would lead, but it didn't matter. It was the only way forward. They ran without looking back, deeper into the winding passageway that had opened before them. The sound of the aliens' voices grew louder, sharper, and closer. The man's grip on her arm tightened, but there was no time for reassurance. His focus was fixed ahead, every step calculated as if he had memorized every inch of this place. For a moment, she wondered if he had been here before, if he had always known where to go. She didn't dare ask, not yet. There were too many questions, too many pieces of the puzzle still missing. The fragments of truth that he had shared with her felt like shards of glass, sharp, dangerous, and incompletely formed. But she had no choice. She had to trust him. The alternative was far worse. The walls around them were slick, almost organic in texture, pulsing with a strange light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air was thick, and the faint hum of machinery echoed in the distance. She could smell something, an acrid scent that burned her nose, but she didn't dare ask what it was. It didn't matter. All that mattered was surviving. The man led her around another corner, his movements swift and precise. She had to struggle to keep up, her breath ragged, her legs still weak from days of captivity. She felt like she was running on pure instinct, a reflex that had been honed by her desperation. As they moved deeper into the labyrinth, the sounds of pursuit started to fade, but she could still hear them, footsteps echoing in the distance, the low growls of the aliens. They were close, but for now, they were safe. At least, for the moment. She wanted to speak, to ask him everything that was racing through her mind, but she kept her silence. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but there was something else there too, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about this situation. Who was he, really? What was his purpose in this chaos? And why had he said that she was the key to stopping the aliens? What did he mean by that? They rounded another corner, and ahead, she saw a large door. It was different from the others, they had been running through endless hallways, but this one stood out. The door was made of solid, polished metal, with intricate patterns etched into its surface. The human didn't pause as they approached, his hand reaching for a panel beside the door. "Wait," she said, almost involuntarily. "Where are we going?" He didn't look at her, his fingers already moving with practiced ease over the control panel. "You'll see." The door slid open with a smooth hiss, revealing a room that was unlike any she had seen before. It was vast, filled with strange equipment, glowing consoles, and large glass tanks that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The walls were lined with various instruments, some of which she couldn't even begin to identify. At the far end of the room was a raised platform, and standing there, illuminated by the soft blue light, was a figure, a woman. She was tall, elegant, and unmistakably human, but there was something strange about her. Her skin seemed to glow faintly, and her eyes, those eyes were unlike any she had ever seen. They were pale, almost white, and they glowed with an inner light, as if she were not entirely of this world. The human stepped into the room, pulling her along with him. "This is Dr. Lara. She's the one who can help us," he said, his voice steady but strained. The woman, Dr. Lara, turned to face them as they entered. There was no recognition in her gaze, no warmth, just a cool, clinical focus. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice sharp. "The Zarnath are closing in on us. We don't have much time." The man nodded, his expression hardening. "I know. I had to get her here. She's the one." Dr. Lara's gaze shifted to the woman beside him. Her eyes studied her for a moment, as if weighing something invisible in the air. "She's the one, is she? You're sure?" "I'm sure," the man said firmly. "I've seen the scans. It's in her blood." The woman nodded, though her expression didn't soften. "We don't have much time, then. Get her onto the table." The human didn't hesitate. He guided the woman over to the table in the center of the room, gently pushing her down onto it. She sat there, unsure of what was about to happen, but the urgency in the air made her heart race. What was going on? What did they mean by her blood? Dr. Lara moved to a console, her hands flying over the buttons with practiced precision. The table beneath the woman shifted, and a small, needle-like device emerged from the side. The woman instinctively recoiled, but the man was already at her side, his hand resting gently on her arm. "It's okay," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "This is for your own safety. Trust me." She nodded, though her nerves were still on edge. What were they doing? What had her blood possibly done to make her important enough to be brought here? Dr. Lara's voice broke through her thoughts. "We need a sample, and we need it now. The Zarnath are coming, and if we don't act quickly, this entire station will be compromised." The woman didn't understand, but she knew that there was no turning back now. She had to trust them. The needle-like device pressed into her skin, and a sharp pain shot through her arm. She gasped but forced herself to stay still, knowing that any sudden movement could ruin everything. She could feel the blood being drawn, an eerie sensation that made her stomach turn. Once the procedure was done, Dr. Lara stepped back, studying the sample with a look of fascination. The woman could see the flicker of something, was it excitement, in her eyes. "This is incredible," Dr. Lara muttered under her breath, almost to herself. "This is exactly what we've been looking for." "What do you mean?" Steady but tinged with something else, something that sounded like awe. "We've studied the Zarnath for years, but we never thought we'd find a specimen like you. It's rare. In fact, you're the only one of your kind." The man, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. His voice was quieter, but no less intense. "We don't have much time. The Zarnath are coming. If they get to you before we can figure out how to use this, they'll enslave you, or worse. And we won't be able to stop them." The woman could feel the weight of his words, but there was something in her chest that refused to let her completely believe it. "And if I help you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What happens to me? Am I just a tool in this war?" Dr. Lara didn't flinch. "No. We're not using you. We're trying to save you. But if you want to survive, you need to understand how important you are." The room was filled with the low hum of the machinery, the tension palpable. The woman closed her eyes, letting the gravity of the situation wash over her. She had been trapped, abused, chained, and used. But now she was something more. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a weapon. She had to be. There was no other explanation. But could she really fight for herself? Could she really take on an alien race hell-bent on her destruction? Suddenly, the room's lights flickered, a loud beep from one of the consoles cutting through the tense silence. The human and Dr. Lara exchanged a glance, and in that moment, the woman knew something had changed. "They found us," the man said, his voice tight with urgency. "We have to move. Now." Before the woman could process his words, the table she had been seated on shifted beneath her, sliding into the floor with a quiet thrum. The man moved swiftly to her side, helping her up, his hands firm but gentle. He didn't say anything, just ushered her toward a set of large, metallic doors that had opened in the far wall. Dr. Lara was already there, her hands moving quickly over a control panel. "Hurry," she urged, her eyes flicking toward the screens as the countdown on one of them began to blink rapidly. The woman's heart was racing now, panic creeping in. "What's happening? Who's coming?" "The Zarnath," the man said, his voice clipped. "And others. We have to get you out of here. We need to find somewhere safe. If they get to you." "I know," she interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know." The doors slid open, revealing a narrow hallway that stretched far into the distance. The sound of footsteps, alien footsteps, echoed down the corridor. The woman's eyes widened in fear, but she was too exhausted, too overwhelmed to react. The man gripped her arm tightly, pulling her into the hallway. "We need to move fast," he urged. They sprinted down the corridor, their footsteps loud against the cold metal floor. The woman's breath was coming in ragged gasps now, her body aching with exhaustion. She had barely any strength left, but she couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Behind them, there was a sound, faint, but growing louder. The unmistakable sound of alien voices, their guttural growls reverberating through the walls. The woman's pulse quickened. "Are they getting closer?" she gasped, her voice trembling. "Too close," the man muttered. "We need to reach the extraction point before they catch up." But as they rounded the corner, the woman caught sight of something, someone. A figure, standing in the shadows, their face obscured. They were watching them. The man didn't hesitate. "Run," he barked, his grip on her tightening. They sprinted ahead, but the woman couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, not just by the Zarnath, but by something else. Something far worse. The corridor stretched out before them, an endless passage of metal and shadows. The woman's legs burned with every step, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could feel the weight of the man's grip on her arm, urging her forward. There was no time to look back, no time to dwell on the fact that they were running for their lives. The sound of the Zarnatha's pursuit echoed through the narrow hallways, growing louder with each passing second. "Faster," the man urged, his voice tense, but calm. He was focused, moving with the kind of precision that only someone who had lived through situations like this could muster. But the woman could sense the strain in his voice, the desperation creeping into his words. They turned another corner, the sharp angles of the passage disorienting. It felt as though they were running in circles, but the man didn't slow down. He knew exactly where he was going. She had to trust him, even though she had no idea who he really was. Everything about this situation felt wrong, but in that moment, all she could focus on was survival. "We're almost there," the man said, glancing over his shoulder. His eyes were narrowed in concentration, scanning the darkened hall behind them. The woman could see the flicker of worry in his gaze, though he tried to hide it. "What do you mean, almost there?" she asked, her voice sharp despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. "Where exactly are we going? And who the hell are you?" The question hung in the air between them, thick and unspoken. The man didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, and for a split second, she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of guilt, of hesitation. It was gone in a heartbeat, replaced by cold determination. "I'll explain everything once we're safe," he said, his voice clipped. "Right now, we need to get you to the extraction point. You can't afford to know anything more until we're out of here." The woman's mind raced, but she couldn't argue with him. Every step they took brought them closer to the unknown, to whatever fate awaited them. She had to survive. She had to get out of this place, whatever it took. They rounded another corner, and this time, the hallway opened up into a vast chamber. The woman's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight before her. It was a control room, massive, and filled with towering machinery. The walls were lined with consoles, glowing softly with a strange, ethereal light. The ceiling was high above them, disappearing into darkness, and the room was filled with a low hum, like the heartbeat of a machine that was too large to comprehend. There was a strange, almost organic quality to the walls, as if the structure itself was alive, pulsing with some unseen force. "Get to the console," the man ordered, his voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. "I'll hold them off. We don't have long." The woman didn't question him. She moved toward the console at the far end of the room, her steps echoing in the cavernous space. She could hear the Zarnatha's voices now, their guttural growls growing louder, closer. They were nearly here. She reached the console, her fingers shaking as she tried to make sense of the array of buttons and screens before her. There were no instructions, no familiar symbols. It was alien technology, completely foreign to her. But she had to try. She had to do something. Behind her, the man was moving toward the entrance to the chamber, positioning himself between the woman and the hallway. She could hear him muttering something under his breath, his voice low but intent. He was preparing himself, getting ready to fight. The woman didn't look back. She focused on the console, pressing buttons at random, trying to make something happen. But nothing. There was no response. Then, she heard the sound that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The Zarnath had arrived. The door to the chamber slammed open, and in the dim light, she could make out their figures, tall, imposing, and inhuman. Their eyes gleamed in the darkness, their weapons raised, ready to strike. But the man was ready too. He didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his body a blur of motion as he moved to engage the first of the Zarnath soldiers. A weapon appeared in his hand, sleek, black, and deadly. He wielded it with a precision that only years of experience could provide. The first Zarnath fell with a sickening thud, but there were more. Always more. The woman's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. She had to help. She had to do something. But the console was still unresponsive. She couldn't just sit there. In a panic, she slammed her palm down onto the surface of the console, hoping for some kind of miracle. And then, something happened. The console flashed to life, and a low hum filled the room. A holographic map appeared on the screen, showing a network of tunnels beneath the facility, an intricate web of corridors that stretched deep into the heart of the structure. She barely had time to process the map before the man's voice cut through the chaos. "Take the escape route," he shouted, his voice strained. "It's our only way out." She didn't wait for him to say anything more. She turned on her heel and sprinted toward the opening in the far wall, the one that had appeared on the map. As she moved, she could hear the sounds of combat behind her, the clash of weapons, the growls of the Zarnath, the desperate cries of the man as he fought to hold them off. But she couldn't look back. She couldn't afford to. The escape route was a narrow tunnel, hidden behind a false wall in the control room. The walls were slick with moisture, and the air felt thick and stale. It was colder here, and the dim light from her console was the only thing illuminating the path ahead. She didn't know how long she had been running, but the pounding of her heart felt like it was the only thing she could hear. She had no idea where this tunnel would lead, no idea if it would even get her out of this place alive. But she had no choice. She had to trust that the man had a plan. That he knew what he was doing. She pushed forward, her legs aching with every step, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. She had to survive. There was no other choice. The tunnel stretched ahead like an endless maw, its walls dark and slick with an unnatural moisture that made the woman's skin crawl. The dim light from her wrist console flickered in the gloom, casting fleeting shadows that danced like ghosts in the narrow passageway. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her legs aching with exhaustion, but she didn't dare stop. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit, the pounding footfalls of the Zarnath, were growing closer, louder with every passing moment. She didn't know how much time had passed since she had bolted from the control room. The man had stayed behind, fighting to buy her enough time to escape. She hadn't heard him since the moment she turned and fled, and that silence gnawed at her. She had to believe he was still alive, he had to be. But the fear that twisted in her gut told her otherwise. There were too many of them, and he was only one man. The tunnel bent to the left, and she followed the path without thinking, her instincts taking over. Her eyes were locked on the faint glow ahead, the only sign of hope in an otherwise hopeless place. If she could make it out of here, if she could survive whatever was waiting for her, she would have a chance. But what would she be without the man who had saved her, without the one person who knew what was really going on? And why had he done it? What was in it for him? A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye caught her attention. Her heart leaped into her throat, but when she looked, there was nothing there, just the dark walls closing in around her. Her mind was playing tricks on her. She was losing it. The panic was getting to her, making every shadow seem like a threat. Keep moving, she told herself. Don't stop. Not until you're safe. Her thoughts spiraled as the passage twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the unknown. She had no idea where she was going. The map on her console had been a blur, a fleeting image of tunnels and escape routes, none of which had offered much comfort. She couldn't stop to study it, it wasn't the time. Not when the Zarnath could be right behind her, hunting her like prey. And then, just when she thought the tunnel couldn't get any narrower, it did. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the air grew thicker, suffocating, as if the very passage itself was alive. She couldn't help but look over her shoulder, half expecting to see the Zarnath's grotesque forms closing in on her. But there was nothing. The silence pressed in, heavy and oppressive. At the end of the tunnel, a faint light broke through the gloom, a door. Her heart raced. This was it. She was almost there. But just as she reached for the door's handle, a new sound echoed down the corridor. A low, vibrating hum, unlike anything she had heard before. Her hand froze inches from the door, her breath catching in her throat. It was too late. They had found her. A heavy thud from behind her made her spine snap straight, and she turned, her pulse quickening. There, at the far end of the tunnel, the unmistakable silhouette of a Zarnath soldier emerged. His massive frame blocked the passage, and his yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness. The weapon in his hands was raised, ready to strike. The woman's mind raced. She had nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. She couldn't fight. She didn't know how. And even if she did, there was no way she could win against something like that. Panic set in. Her legs trembled, her chest tightened with the rush of fear, but her mind, in a moment of clarity, knew what she had to do. She sprinted toward the door. With every step, the Zarnath's laughter echoed in the tunnel, mocking her, the sound like a death knell. He knew she had nowhere to run, no way out. But the woman wasn't done yet. She reached the door, slammed her shoulder into it, and it swung open, into another hallway. She didn't look back. She didn't wait for the Zarnath's next move. The hallway was even darker than the tunnel, and she could feel the walls closing in again, squeezing her with every step. But there was something else here. A pull, a strange energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. It was different from anything she had felt before, unearthly. Something was waiting for her. As she ran, her mind raced back to the man who had helped her. Was he still alive? Was he still fighting? The question ate away at her, gnawing at her every step. But she couldn't stop. Not now. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows seeming to reach out to her, wrapping around her like a suffocating cloak. She had no idea where she was going, but the pull was stronger now, guiding her forward. It was as if something, or someone, was calling her. Her wrist console beeped suddenly, startling her. She glanced down at it, and a message flashed across the screen. Secure the core. It's your only chance. She barely had time to process the words when the ground beneath her feet shifted. A low rumble vibrated through the walls, and the air turned electric. She felt it in her chest, a thrum that resonated deep in her bones. Whatever this place was, it was alive. Secure the core, she whispered to herself, trying to make sense of the message. But there was no time to think about it. The Zarnath were still close behind. She could hear their growls, their heavy footsteps thundering down the passageway. Ahead, the hallway opened up into a massive chamber. The walls of the room were jagged, organic, as if the very structure had grown out of the stone itself. The air was thick with the smell of something metallic, something ancient. And there, in the center of the room, was a pedestal. On top of it, a glowing orb, the core. It pulsed with a soft, blue light, sending waves of energy through the room. It was calling to her, drawing her in. This was it. The core. She didn't know why she knew it, but she knew. This was the key. Whatever the man had been trying to protect, whatever they had been running from, it all came down to this. She ran toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the Zarnath closing in. She could feel their presence, their growing rage. But this was it. She had to act. She reached out, her fingers brushing the orb, and the moment she touched it, a shockwave of energy surged through her, knocking her back. The room spun around her, the walls distorting as the power of the orb flowed into her. And then, everything went black.